Hello, we want to welcome you to our House of Blessing English Bible study. Right now, as a church, on Sunday mornings, we're going through a sermon series called Disciple. And we're really thinking through how are we being made into disciples of Christ? So what's the process of discipleship for ourselves, as well as how do we make disciples? What does that process look like? As we go through 1st and 2nd Timothy, we realize what a treasure they are, because in them Paul is trying to help his disciple Timothy to make disciples in the church of Ephesus. And as we go through these letters and look at the issue of discipleship, we're also learning more about how do we study the Bible for ourselves. And as we did that last week, we got a chance to start to look into 1 Timothy chapter 2. And we really zeroed in on chapter 2, verses 11 through 15. Why did we zero in on them? Because there are some big issues that this passage is being debated and discussed and utilized for, and it has to do with women and Christianity. Questions like, can women be leaders in the church? Can they be pastors or elders? Can women teach or preach in a corporate worship system or service? And so as we looked into this passage, we realized, wow, we really need all our inductive skills of observation, interpretation, and application. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the other passages by Paul in some of his letters in Ephesians and in Corinthians, in which he also addresses the issue not just of women in ministry and women in church service, but he also talks about the Christian marriage and what God desires for husbands and for wives, because as we will see, those two issues become very related to the church and to how we answer what we're going to do with 1 Timothy chapter 2. Now, I believe that this time period that we live in, we have a great opportunity as a church to show how does the gospel impact this issue of marriage? How does the gospel impact this issue of women and the treatment of women? Now, of course, when Jesus came on the earth 2,000 years ago and you read through the Gospels, you can see that Jesus was radically different than the culture around him, and how he honored women and how he treated them as beautiful daughters of the Father. You can see that in his interactions with Mary and with Martha. You can see that in the way that he interacted with the Syrophoenician woman and healed her child. And of course, just even the way the narrative of the Gospels plays out in the fact that the people that were there at the cross were mostly women. And then the first witnesses to his resurrection were women. And all of this, when you put it together with the from Genesis to Revelation, we can see that God's kingdom does impact that area and should impact that area of our worldview and our lives. However, of course, when we are students of history and we look back 2,000 years of church history, we know that we've often squandered that. We've often spoiled what Jesus came to bring as far as freedom and the valuation of women, that we got the teaching wrong and we have not represented the gospel in that. And yet, as things have now changed, as we talked about, and even in the last 100 years, and women's rights and the treatment of women and social justice issues such as stopping the abuse of women, domestic violence, or sex trafficking, God is giving us an opportunity to continue to show how this new treatment, this new movement is not really new, but it's what God intended from Genesis chapter 1 in the way that he specifically created women to be his beautiful daughters. We talked about others that he's been using in ministry to advance his kingdom, like Gladys Aylward, who gave her life and sacrificed in order to come to China. And when she was there, as she preached the gospel, it impacted how she saw the culture. And she was part of a movement to get rid of foot binding and to try to lift up the Chinese women to what God had created them to be. Mother Teresa as well, when she went to India and she brought the gospel impacted how she not only treated other women, but how she treated everyone who was devalued, who were untouchables, who were of a lower caste, not worthy of education, and not worthy of medical treatment, not worthy of the government's help. And so really it was the same thing that Mother Teresa, Gladys Aylward, all of them, they saw this opportunity to represent Christ in our culture. And that's why it's so critical that as we look through these passages of Paul, that we keep the overall big picture and God's character and nature in mind, and we don't get so caught up in the details of these specific theological views that we miss out on the heart of Christ. Now, I want to do a little bit of review of where we left off last time, because we covered a lot of ground, and when we finished, we were talking about how do we walk out? How do we do the step of application in that passage in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 15? And as I walked you through the three main options or the three main views of application of this passage and how it regards to women, basically I began to show you some of the different tools that we can use in inductive Bible study for application. And then there's so many. Because application can be intense, can be very complicated to take something from the Bible 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago and bring it into our 21st century cultural situation. So I said the first application or the first option of how to view 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 through 15 saw it as a temporal situation, and temporal means time bound. That means there were things going on at the time that Paul was writing the letter to Timothy in the church of Ephesus that basically caused the command to not allow women to teach and not allow women to usurp or to gain authority over men. And they said those cultural issues in the background had to do with the fact that not only were women uneducated at that particular time, but also they were coming out of this background of Artemis worship, which was influencing their views of women incorrectly and influencing the fact that the only place that women might have authority might be in the religious sphere. And so Paul gave that specific command to that church to address that specific situation. He did not intend this to be a timeless truth or a general command then for all churches of the first century. And that's how they explain other women that Paul seems to be working with, like Phoebe, who is a deaconess in Romans 16, or Priscilla, who seemed to be a church leader along with her husband in teaching. There were others that he worked with who were women who seemed to be in other locations that are teaching and seem to have some type of leadership in their interpretation. And so that's how they can bring them together. The timeless truth behind it would be that we should never allow anyone who is uneducated theologically or anyone who is still coming out of a false religion background and has not worked into a maturity in Christ, none of them should be leaders or teachers. That's the timeless truth behind the teaching of 1 Timothy 2, option number 1. Option number 2 was what we called progressive revelation, and we likened that to New Testament slavery. So they said, no, Paul really did mean this as a first century church rule, that in the churches that he planted, overall, most women were going to be uneducated secularly and uneducated theologically. So not all of them would be coming out of a false goddess worship, but the education wasn't there, and as well, the cultural situation of the patriarchal kind of setup of marriage and of their society. Basically, Paul viewed those things and he said, I don't allow women to teach or to preach. I don't allow them to have leadership in this time period because we need to deal with first things first. We need to get the foundational issues of the gospel, salvation, the character and nature of Christ and of God. And we've got to get those things corrected and on the right track before we can deal with secondary issues that God cares about, but they're not salvation eternal issues. And so this correct view to them of women and their roles and of marriage was supposed to be a progressive revelation. So Paul gave the principles like Galatians 3:28 so that eventually the church could, again, put women into a place to be educated and to put Christian marriage into a place of equality. And then when they reached that place, then women could be leaders and they could be teachers, just like he gave them the principles about slavery. He didn't say don't have slaves, but what he said was treat slaves like brothers. What he said was there is no longer slave or free. And so that same principle was given to them so that as a secondary issue that God cared about, the church would eventually get rid of slavery and stop treating people like property in the same way that eventually they would see that women have the gifts and the abilities to lead and to teach. So that's the progressive revelation, progressive over time. The third option was that this is a timeless truth. That not only did Paul mean this for the first century and for all of the churches to follow, that women should not preach in a worship service, they should not be the top leaders, elders, or pastors. He meant that to be a timeless truth. And this particular view ties that to a view of marriage, that Paul's commands are related to his view of God's created purposes for men and for women in marriage and in the church. So when we step back, we can actually think about this from an applicational point of view that's going to help us as we go through all the passages in the Bible. And that's part of our goal as we do these Tuesday night Bible studies, not just give you kind of some answers about specific passages, but give the tools to you so that as you study through other difficult issues and passages, it gives you a way to try to arrive at correct, sound doctrine. So when it comes to application, you can tell with those three options that there were kind of two ways to look at how we apply the teaching and the laws and the commands of the Bible. One way says that there are some teachings in the Bible, some laws or some commands that are bound up in a temporal situation. And again, temporal means time bound. So these believe that this teaching or this law that is wrapped up into a time-bound situation, it has relevance for a specific cultural situation that is tied to that intended audience. The intended audience in this case being Paul, Timothy, Church of Ephesus, the first century Greco-Roman world. However, they believe that once you understand that cultural temporal situation, you can pull a timeless truth out from behind it. And there is always a timeless truth out behind it. So again, for their particular view of 1 Timothy chapter 2, they see the temporal situation as women being uneducated, as being a secondary issue to the gospel coming into unreached areas. And so the timeless truth behind it for them was don't allow uneducated people to be leaders or preachers or teachers in our church. Now, the second way that we deal with some of the application in the Bible is that we believe the teaching or the law or the command is timeless. So when Paul tells a church something, then that truth is true for 2,000 years ago and it's true today. Which means that there is no cultural temporal situation that we need to unpack or understand. We can just directly apply it in much the same way. So it's still helpful to understand the cultural background, but we don't need this extra step of sifting the timeless truth out from the temporal or the time-based situation. Now, I've heard from many Christians that they feel like, well, that's kind of a very dangerous way of doing application, because then you're able to just say for any application, any command or teaching that you don't like, then you could just pick and choose and you could say, well, this particular passage about women or about money or about whatever it is, that's just a cultural temporal situation. That was just for them, and I don't need to apply that today. So it allows kind of this buffet style of pick and choose Bible application that can be so dangerous, where you just have kind of this easy get out of jail free, play the temporal cultural card, and I don't have to obey that particular command. Everything is timeless in the Bible. If it's super straightforward, like 2 Timothy 2:11 through 15, then we should be able to just directly apply it today in the same way. The reality is, though, I have not met any Christians that apply all the scripture of the Bible without considering the temporal or cultural situation for some of them. And I want to give you a couple of examples of that. Okay, for example, if we have a passage like Ephesians 2:8 through 9. In that passage, Paul says that we are saved by grace through faith, not by works. Now, as we look at that teaching, that is true 2,000 years ago. It is true today. And Even though there was a cultural background and other religious issues when Paul gave that timeless truth to the Ephesians, we don't need to unpack it or to do an extra step to sift through a timeless truth behind that temporal situation. You were saved by faith 2,000 years ago. You're saved by faith the same way and not by works today. So that's an example of where we can just directly take the teaching as a timeless truth. However, Paul also tells the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 26, he says to them, greet one another with a holy kiss. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, I have been to a lot of churches, and I have never been to a church where when I come into the church, another brother or a sister give me a smooch, kiss me, whether it's on the lips or on the cheeks. Now, why are we all being disobedient to the Word of God? Well, it's because as we read that passage, we think, oh, well, this is clearly bound up in culture. This is a temporal situation. What Paul is saying to them is greet one another, and we interpret it and apply it in a culturally relevant or specific way. So back in Paul's time, part of their culture in the Thessalonian church was to greet one another with a kiss. And there are still a few cultures that do that. It might be very appropriate to give a kiss on the right or the left, and you greet someone. However, in a lot of churches, and in most churches, if you tried to kiss a fellow Christian when they were coming in, you might highly offend them. You might be getting punched in the face by a husband. I mean, who knows what kind of offense you could cause by kissing someone in some of the cultures today. What you would do is find a culturally appropriate way to follow Paul's command. The timeless truth behind it is greet one another in a culturally appropriate way. That might be a handshake, might be a buddy hug, that might be a bow or a lowering of the eyes. Basically, when you see a fellow believer, are you warm, are you hospitable, or do you greet them so that they know that you care about them, you acknowledge them? We go on to Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. And that should be a familiar passage to you because it says, you shall honor your father and your mother. It's one of the 10 commandments. And so when we look at that, yes, it would probably be more interesting if we learned a little bit more about the culture of Moses' day when he gave the Israelites that law at Mount Sinai. But when we go to apply that, we can apply that directly in our 21st century context. We can say, you need to honor your father and your mother. There's no sifting out of a temporal situation in order to get the timeless truth behind it. But just one chapter later, as Moses continues to give them the law, he gives them another law. And this law goes something like this. Let me paraphrase. If you go out and you dig a hole and your neighbor's ox falls into the hole, then basically you need to go and give the neighbor the money equivalent to the value of that ox. Now, as you look at that law, you'd be like, this law has nothing to do with me. I don't go digging holes. I don't own any oxen. My neighbors don't own any oxen that are likely going to be falling into a hole. So what do I do with this law? Well, you could just ignore it, but that's not a good idea because God's included it in his scriptures for you. What you could do is say there's a temporal situation. This was an agricultural society, and obviously oxes falling into neighbors' holes, it happened. It was something that happened. And so what God cared about here was personal accountability and restitution. So that's our timeless truth behind it. If you do something that causes damage to someone else, say if you accidentally run into someone's motorcycle or car and it's totally your fault, then your personal responsibility is to repair the motorcycle or the car, to pay for the damage to their property. You need to be accountable. So see, there's another example of how when we read that law, we have to understand the temporal situation and then think about what the timeless truth is behind it. So as Christians, we do this. There are all kinds of situations. It's just that some of them were like, oh, well, this is clearly like the kiss, clearly cultural. Where in other situations, we might not agree on what's cultural and on what is timeless. And that's our situation when we deal with some of these passages on women in ministry and when we deal with some of these passages on Christian marriage. So the complication is already there, and we just need to use our brains, and we need to think through and pray together and talk together about, in each situation, how do we do that process of application. Now, for your home study, you're going to get a chance to practice this more and to dig in for yourself. We're not going to do the passages from 1 Timothy. We're going to take a break from that and give you a chance to look into what else does Paul have to say about women in ministry, and what else does Paul have to say about marriage, because as I said, those two issues are interconnected, they're related. And so as you go through the passage in Ephesians 5 about marriage, and then two passages in which Paul addresses women in the church service in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 1 Corinthians 14, make sure you do your good inductive tools. Take your time as you read through it and do the observation questions. Gather up all your details. Then when you get into interpretation, don't jump to application yet. Think about Paul and Timothy and the Ephesians and their culture and their situation and their churches 2,000 years ago. With Corinth, maybe you don't know much about the city of Corinth. A good chance to look that up and start to think about what the big picture of the book of Corinthians is about. So you can download those and work on those as a group or by yourself. Now, before we get into the passages, I want to give you a little bit of help with Ephesians chapter 5, with 1 Corinthians 11, and with 1 Corinthians 14, because there are things in them that are debated, and there are things that are difficult to understand, just like we had in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Before we do that, however, I want to kind of take a step back and tell you that as we think about the issue of women in ministry, can women be leaders or pastors? Can women teach or preach? You need to see that for most Christians, the issue of women in ministry is completely tied together with the issue of Christian marriage. And so for a lot of believers, you can't separate the two. However, Christian marriage is meant to work, will have an impact on their view of, can women be leaders and can women preach and teach? And so in this particular debate, there are kind of two main sides of the argument. Now, there's a lot of nuances, there's a lot of gray areas in here, but I want to at least keep it as black and white here as possible so you understand the two main views on Christian marriage, and you'll see how that impacts then their views on women in ministry. The first view is called complementarianism. Big word. Complementarianism comes from the word compliment. Now, we think in English of the word compliment is to say something nice about somebody. But the word compliment can also have the meaning of to complete something in a way that is different but makes it whole. So to complement something, you've got like beverage and you've got food that can complement one another. In other words, the beverage and the food goes well together, the flavors, the taste. And in the same way, they say God created men and women to complement each other, not just to say nice things about each other, which they should, but to complement each other's gifts and abilities. And so that as the two come together, then they reach their full potential for marriage and they reach their full potential for Christian ministry in the church today. And in that, they say that husband and wife are equal in value. They have equal inheritance in the spiritual kingdom of God. They are equal in value in God's eyes, but they have different roles. That God created them differently, mainly because he had different roles for them in marriage and he had different roles for them in the church. And so in that, they see the Christian marriage as working where the men have the primary role of being the authority or the head of the family, and therefore men have the primary role of leadership and preaching and teaching within the church. So you see that connection. If men are the head of the family, they are the leader of the family, and they guide the family, and they are responsible for the spiritual condition of the family, then in the church it is connected that men would be the main leaders of the church and would be the main ones in charge of the spiritual teaching and preaching of the church. So the way that they view what we'll look at in Ephesians 5, this issue of headship, they see head having the figurative meaning of being authority. So when it says the husband is the head of the wife, they feel like the figurative meaning of head there applies to authority. And so for them, the way they view this issue of women in ministry is to see it as a timeless truth, that women are not to teach or to have authority over men, not because they're less valuable in God's eyes, but because they have different God-given roles, and those roles apply in the church and they apply in marriage. Now, the other side of this position in Christianity is called egalitarianism, and that's taken from the word equal. And so in this view, men and women in marriage and the church are equal to each other, and not just equal in value, but also can have equal roles. And so to them, when they look at what Paul says about headship, headship to them has the figurative meaning of source. So just like a woman was taken from the man in creation in Genesis, then in the same way that in the headship is meaning of source. So the husband is the source of love, he is the source of nourishment, but it has nothing to do with an authority structure. Again, there's equality between the male and the female in marriage, and there should be equality within the church. So this means to them that the New Testament was just dealing with a temporal situation. And so they differ on whether they see this as just church by church specific, that first applicational option, or whether they see it as progressive revelation, where eventually the church was to address this and bring women to their full equality in the marriage and full equality in the church. They disagree on whether number 2 or number 3 are correct, but they agree at least on what it's supposed to look like today, for sure. And so these are the two main views. Now there'll be on the other side extreme liberal feminism. There'll be on the other side extreme patriarchal churches and teaching. But these are kind of the main two views within evangelical Christianity. And so I wanted to at least prepare you with that first. Now, before we can look at the passage in Ephesians, we need to look back at Genesis 1 through 3 real quick. And the reason we need to look at those is because Paul keeps referring to it. Remember when we got into 1 Timothy chapter 2, as he made his proclamation or commands about women in leadership and women preaching or teaching, he went back to Adam and Eve. And what we will find is that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when he's dealing with, again, this issue of headship between men and women, he goes back once again to Adam and Eve. And so because Paul sees these as being connected, he sees marriage, Christian marriage, and women in ministry being connected to the created order, and he sees it as being related to Genesis chapters 1 through 3, then I think we need to go back and review what do we really learn about men and women and about marriage from Genesis 1 through 3. Well, in a shortened, condensed version, what we learn from chapter 1 is that God made man and woman in his image. So that's that equality. We are both made in the image of God. However, it does tell us that he made them different, because he says male and female, he created them. So from the very beginning, even though both male and females represent or reflect the image of God, they are still different and distinct. He made two separate genders that are not the same. In chapter 2, he breaks that down more when he talks about the fact that he made humanity for relationship with him and relationship with one another. And that is displayed by the fact that Adam is alone and it's not good. And therefore God creates all the animals, but in the animals there is not found a suitable helper or an alike helper. And so God creates woman as the ultimate answer to create this human relationship for his created man, Adam. So when it says there that he created woman as an alike helper, sometimes NIV I think says suitable helper, but in the Hebrew, the word helper is the same word that we use generically for all situations of help. And in fact, in the Psalms, it's used when it talks about God being our helper. So it has no connotation of authority there. It has no connotation of a specific valuation or any kind of description of what that means in a role. It just says helper, and it uses the adjective there, like helper, helper of his kind. So not like the animals, but something that was like him, that was like a man, and yet could help the man with the areas of his relationship that the animals could not help him with. And so it helps the man to achieve relationship, to achieve love, and this is kind of that sense that the two become one flesh, that they are alike, they are more alike than the animals. However, they are different in the sense that the two can come together to become one, male, female, two separate genders. Now in chapter 3, of course, the fall happens. Adam and Eve are both guilty. They both eat the apple. They both disobey God. And there's a drastic impact of sin that impacts marriage, and it impacts all of creation. However, we need to specifically zero in and see that one of the impacts of sin listed to the woman was that the desire for the wife will be for her husband, but the husband will rule over her. And there's a clear negative meaning with that. This is a sense of the negative impact of sin. That man and woman, the two were meant to become one flesh, to complete one another in that sense, to bring one another relationship and love and joy. But the impact of sin will eventually be that the woman has this desire for her husband, but oftentimes the husband will abuse. He will rule over her instead of loving her, instead of just having this relationship. So it would be great if we could look at Genesis 1 through 3 and say, well, who is right? Is the complementarians? Is that what is being taught in Genesis 1 through 3? Or is it egalitarianism taught in the creation of man and woman and the creation of marriage and gender? Well, both sides kind of see this to support their view. Egalitarians say, well, the fact that God created woman from a rib, that proves that their view is correct. Because if God wanted to say that woman is to be in a lesser role, to be in submission or in authority under the man, then God should have picked like the leg or the foot, a lower extremity. If God wanted women to be in charge of men, so for women to be the authority, then he would have picked a part like from the shoulder or from the head and made woman out of that. But the fact that God made woman from a rib of the man, it was basically a symbolic meaning behind that they were to be equal, right? The rib, it's in the middle. It's a sense that God was saying male and female are equal. However, complementarians look at that and they say, well, this whole thing though shows that God created man and woman differently, two different genders, and that the two genders complement one another. It complements one another sexually. The way that God has designed male and female are perfect complement in the sexual union in marriage. And then he gave them different roles, because clearly he said be fruitful and multiply, and it takes two of them in order to do that, but only the woman can provide the egg, and only the male can provide the seed. And so, even in being fruitful and multiply, they have different roles within that same commission from God. So they would argue that Genesis 1 through 3 really shows the complementary nature of male and female and of marriage. And they would say the problem in chapter 3 is that the woman tried to take a place of leadership and then offered her husband the apple, and instead of asserting his leadership, spiritual leadership, in that, he just followed the instructions of his wife. And so you can see that both views can look at Genesis 1 through 3 and use it and say it supports our particular view going all the way back to creation. So unfortunately, going back to Genesis 1 through 3, you're still going to have to look at that for yourself, because in those chapters, there's no specific description of headship, and there's no specific description of authority. You'd have to take, again, the implication of these passages and go one direction or another with it.